Before we begin, don't forget that there are currently 3 applications out for the Queen's Gambit Decline, available for iPhone and for Android. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at a very interesting and instructive game that I played as part of a Blitz series that we're releasing on this channel. During the game, White played an offbeat opening which allowed us to create a very instructive strategic position. White had very good chances at one point in the game, but after a couple inaccuracies, Black, me in this case, gained an upper hand and I quickly won the game. We'll get a chance to see all of it today. Let's take a look. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we're going to continue our trend of taking a look at some Blitz games that I played on chess.com. In the following game, I'm rated about 200 rating points higher than my opponent at the time that we played the game, meaning that my winning chances are approximately 75% according to the ELO system. And so I had little trouble winning this particular game, but there should still be some good food for thought. White began with the move pawn to c4, the English opening. I continued pawn to e6, which recently I've been playing around with, since right now I've done some products on the Queen's Gambit Decline and happen to know quite a bit about these positions. White played e3. This is automatically reducing his chances for the initiative since he's blocking in the dark squared bishop. More common would be the move pawn to d4, pawn to d5, knight to c3, and then there are a couple different ways that this position can pan out. But in the game, my opponent played the move pawn to e3. I continued pawn to d5, knight f3, knight f6, b3, and it's just a matter of where I want to go ahead and constellate my pieces here. I played the move pawn to c5 so that I can get my knight out. Unconsciously, I followed the rule of knights before bishops, because after bishop b2, I played knight c6. The basic point being I want to start controlling the center as quickly as possible, so I've got some extra coverage of the d4 square now. And of course, it's not totally clear where I want to develop the bishops, and this is actually why this principle, this idea was developed, that oftentimes we want to develop our knights before bishops, but it's not always true. Knight c6 was played, pawn to a3. White is really taking his time completing his general development, and by this time I already feel that Black has at least equalized the position. So bishop e7 was played, d3, another very slow move. I captured on c4. This is probably because right now his bishop can't recapture the pawn. He has to recapture more or less with the b pawn, since if he captures with the d pawn, he's inevitably going to lose some time with the king, which is going to slow his development down, since now the king is on d1 and can't castle. Therefore, after d takes c4, he has to recapture with the b pawn, and he already now has an isolated pawn on a3, and he's going to have some problems with this pawn on d3. This pawn on d3 is currently on an open file and can become a target for attack, and if the pawn moves to the d4 square, it can be captured, and still the pawns on d4 and c4 can potentially be targets. So this was rather quick thinking because we're playing a Blitz game here. But I played the move d takes c4 rather quickly here, within 1 second in fact. B takes c4 was played, pawn to b6, getting on with development of the light squared bishop. Knight bd2, bishop b7, queen c2, castles kingside, bishop to e2, queen to c7, so I've completed my general development. My rooks are connected, and now White castles kingside as well. Still, the game is just continuing on. Nothing major happening right now, but I rather like Black's position. Again, Black has a little bit of a structural edge because this d-pawn is going to have some problems. White still has a decent position, but I played the move pawn to e5 in order to create further restraint against the d-pawn, and perhaps at some moment to play the move pawn to e4. My opponent continued rook a to c1. I continued rook a to d8. My opponent continued queen to b1, so he's playing this, I believe this is like a hedgehog.
there's an opening in the English where black can play this exact same setup that white is using, and basically he just hides behind this very controlled structure on e3 and d3 and uses it as an opportunity to maneuver his pieces about. And because I was just a little bit familiar with this idea, I could see that he's trying to move the queen to a1 as a way of putting pressure on the e-pawn. So white is just kind of playing around here and seeing what happens with the position. I retreated my knight in order to answer queen a1, which he played with the move pawn to f6. Rook fe1 was played, and here I wasn't feeling very confident that much of anything was happening in this position since I didn't see a concrete plan. So after 13 seconds, I simply played knight a5, which is seeing what does he do with this knight on d2. If he moves it, I'm going to sink that knight into the b3 square, so this creates just a little bit of a problem for white. Now, to me, it seems like if he plays bishop c3, I might not have anything better but than to retreat the knight back to the c6 square, and then we'll see what happens next. So knight a5 was just grasping for straws because I really didn't see very many ways to make progress. But conveniently, my opponent played the move queen to b1, not disturbing the knight quite yet. Now knight d6 would be a nice move here, but I instead played queen to c8. Again, just playing around, perhaps bringing the queen to e6 and seeing what happens next. Now I really like this move by my opponent. He suddenly opens up the position, and this is the kind of thing that can happen in this, again, I want to call this a hedgehog structure, which is a structure where oftentimes the opponent using this kind of setup with pawns on e3 and d3, or in the case of black, when he's using the same structure, he would have pawns on e6 and d6. White will suddenly lash out and open up the position and see if he can catch black just a little bit off balance in this position. And in this game, he almost managed to do it, because I captured the pawn, he captured the pawn, I captured the pawn, and now he missed an outstanding opportunity. White could have played the move bishop to d3, which would have created a threat against the h7 pawn with check, and mind you, this d4 pawn is still going to end up falling, and at the same time, there's a threat against the bishop on e7. And so this is a very, very strong idea for white, which he could have played, but he misses it. He captures the pawn on d4, and now actually black is the one with a stronger position, as I quickly play bishop c5, putting pressure on the knight on d4. The c4 pawns and a3 pawns are now weaknesses. My knight is ready to jump to the d6 square after knight to f3, which was played in the game. Knight to d6, the c4 pawn is starting to come under observation. And now white did play the move bishop d3, but he's just a little bit too late. My queen came out to g4, just creating massive complications in this position. But another approach would have been rook f to e8. It's difficult to defend the h7 pawn here, and I just didn't want to do it. I rather would sack the pawn and open up the board with complications. Again, something we're going to see very often throughout these Blitz games is that I like this idea of creating complications by sacrificing pawns or taking some sort of temporary strategic problem into my own position. The idea is that in a slightly worse position, we're putting the psychological anus on the opponent. The opponent is then kind of forced by inertia. He's going to want to try to translate his advantage into a victory. But in the process, if we continue to play strong chess and we make the best of our opportunities, the situation can change, can reverse very suddenly. So I play queen g4, tempting him into bishop takes h7 check. And after 11 seconds, he doesn't even take the pawn. However, taking the pawn was the best move. Bishop takes h7 check, king to h8, h3, queen h5, bishop g5, queen h6, bishop d3. This is a line that I worked out with the machine afterwards, but it's pretty obvious that white needs to go ahead and take the pawn. This maneuver around bishop g6 is maybe not so easy to find. But in this position, white's up a pawn. He still has some problems with his pawn structure, but if he plays things just right, he can hold on to his advantage for quite some time. However, my opponent did not play bishop takes h7 check. Instead, he played h3, and then my queen was able to defend the pawn on h7. And after this move, black clearly has an advantage because of his better pawn structure, the better placement. In fact, all of these pieces are actually operating quite nicely in the position, and now there's no threat of losing the h7 pawn. White played rook to e3, I played rook fe8, and now things are quickly collapsing after he played rook c to e1. This removes a defender from the c4 pawn, and so right away I was able to create a strong play with rook takes e3, rook takes e3, knight d takes c4, and everything is collapsing. The rook is under attack, the bishop is eyeballing this knight, the knight is also underprotected, the bishop is under attack on b2, the pawn on a3 is under attack twice, almost everything is under attack in this position, and it's just going to be a matter of looking very closely at the position after my opponent's next move and finding the right reply. So white plays the move knight to e6, and now just a little bit of thought here. Knight takes e3, knight takes d8, bishop takes f3, and by now we've exceeded the rule. There's a principle in chess which I found in a book by Colin Crouch entitled Attacking Technique, in which Colin Crouch said, if we have 3 pieces near the king, there's a pretty good chance of attacking the king successfully, because it takes 1 piece to sack and usually 2 to mate. And he also said if we have 4 pieces near the king, we have an excellent chance of a successful attack. And here we've got 4 pieces, all near the king. Any capture by white is going to leave the king open, and then it's just going to be a matter of figuring out the correct way of landing the attack. My opponent thought for some time and then played queen a2. The bishop retreated back to d5, so in this position, I'm actually up a full piece. He played queen to a1. Queen to g5 was played. Now I'm just bearing down on this g-pawn. Bishop to f1 was played, and now my opponent resigned after knight takes g2. Again, 4 pieces around the king. Black's up a piece. The knight on d8 is actually trapped here as well. So this is just a very, very awful position to be looking at for white, and he simply gave up the struggle as he's going to be mated fairly quickly. What can we learn from this game? Well, in this particular example, I'm not familiar enough with hedgehog situations to be able to give any great advice about the opening, but hopefully you still learned a little bit of something from how I intuitively set up the pieces for black, gained a decent position, and that at a certain moment, white was able to get out of his position with that move pawn to d4, and for just a couple moments in the game, he had chances to create a better position. However, when he failed to do so, very quickly we found that my pieces were actually in appropriate spots, and the weaknesses which I created, remember that early on I played the move d takes c4, knowing that there were going to be some weaknesses on c4 and a3 on the long term, and finally the c4 pawn ended up being a problem for white and ended up being the hook with which I was able to suddenly activate all of my pieces. I super hope that this has been enjoyable and interesting for you. As always, I much appreciate your viewership and you taking a look at these videos. And that's all I have for today. That's all for today, and we'll see you again soon.
Before you go, be sure to check out the 2 applications we have available for the King's Indian Defense, available for iPhone and for Android.